The story of Svetlana and her family began not with a dramatic event, but with a slow, creeping decay of hope, much like the way rust claims untreated metal. They lived in Minsk in 1986, in a typical Khrushchevka, a 5-story concrete panel building where the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors' arguments and the smell of cabbage soup permeated the stairwell like a permanent, slightly sour perfume. Their apartment was a small, 2-room affair, a space defined more by what it lacked than what it contained. The furniture, all standard issue and utilitarian, seemed to sigh under the weight of the collective disappointment it had witnessed over the years. A faded rug, a souvenir from a long-ago trip to the Baltic coast, hung on the main wall, its vibrant colors muted by time and the weak light that struggled through the single window overlooking a bleak courtyard where children played listlessly and old men gathered to share cigarettes and silent commiseration. Anatoly, Svetlana's father, was a man in his late 40s, an engineer at the Minsk tractor works. His was a world of precise calculations, tolerances, and technical drawings, a world of order that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic, often illogical reality of daily Soviet life. He had once believed fervently in the system, in the promise of a radiant future built by the hands of the proletariat. That belief had slowly eroded year by year, replaced by a weary pragmatism. His hands, though often stained with grease from the factory, were those of a thinker, with long, delicate fingers that would trace lines on the kitchen table as he explained some complex mechanical principle to his daughter. But lately, those same hands had developed a slight tremor, a physical manifestation of the anxiety that had taken root in his soul. Irina, his wife, was a librarian. She existed in a different realm, one of whispered conversations and the soft rustle of turning pages. The city library where she worked was her sanctuary, a place where the outside world, with its endless queues for sausage and the constant, low-grade hum of political paranoia, could be held at bay. She was a small, bird-like woman with kind, tired eyes that had seen too much of life's quiet hardships. Her love for her family was a fierce, protective flame, but it was a flame that was constantly being tested by the cold winds of their circumstances. She saw the worry etch deeper into Anatoly's face with each passing month, and she felt a corresponding tightness in her own chest, a dread she could not name. Svetlana, at 17, stood on the precarious bridge between childhood and adulthood. She possessed her mother's quiet demeanor and her father's analytical mind, a combination that made her intensely observant. She was pretty in a way that was not immediately striking. Her beauty was in the seriousness of her gray eyes and the thoughtful curve of her mouth. Her escape, her passion, was literature. While her peers dreamed of Western jeans and rock music tapes, Svetlana dreamed of the worlds contained within the battered covers of the books she borrowed from her mother's library. She dreamed of Leningrad's university halls, of studying philology, of dissecting the great works of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. It was a dream that felt both sacred and impossibly distant, a dream that required rubles they did not have. The catalyst for their undoing was, like so many tragedies, born from a noble intention. Anatoly wanted to give his daughter a chance. He saw her brilliance, her potential, and it pained him to think it might be extinguished by the grim machinery of their existence. His salary was stagnant, a pittance that vanished almost as soon as it arrived, swallowed by the costs of food, utilities, and the simple, grinding effort of survival. The black market, the Blatt system of connections and favors, was the only real economy that mattered, and Anatoly, a man of principle and blueprints, had no talent for it. It was at the factory that he heard the name, whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence: Boris. Boris was a Tsekhovik, a master of the underground workshops that produced goods the state could not or would not supply. He was not a common thug. He was a businessman of the shadows, a man of substance and influence. He operated from a small, private office above a bakery on the outskirts of the city, a location that afforded him both a degree of privacy and a constant, disarming aroma of fresh bread. People said he could get you anything: a new carburetor, a Finnish winter coat, a ticket to a concert that was officially sold out. More importantly, people said he had capital. He lent money. Driven by a desperate, paternal love, Anatoly arranged a meeting. The office was not what he had expected. It was sparsely furnished, with a sturdy desk, 2 chairs, and a single large safe in the corner. The smell of yeast from below was overpowering. Boris himself was a man in his late 40s, with a thick, powerful neck and hands that looked like they could bend steel. He wore a simple, well-made suit, and his eyes were the most striking feature. They were pale, almost colorless, and they held no warmth, only a flat, assessing calm. He listened without interruption as Anatoly, his voice slightly unsteady, laid out his plan. A contact at the port, a shipment of high-quality Turkish leather, a network of shoemakers and bag makers desperate for good material. It was a sound plan, a profitable plan. He needed a loan, a significant one, for the initial capital. Boris asked few questions. His gaze seemed to weigh Anatoly's soul, measuring his fear, his desperation, his honesty. After a long silence, he agreed. The terms were stated clearly, without emotion. The interest rate was usurious, the repayment schedule brutal. It was a debt designed to be difficult to escape. Anatoly, his mind filled with visions of Svetlana in a university dormitory, of Irina no longer fretting over every kopeck, signed his name on a simple piece of paper. It was not a legal document. Its power derived not from the state, but from the man sitting across from him. In that moment, Anatoly sold a piece of his future, and by extension, the future of his family, for a glimpse of a better life. He walked out of the bakery, the sweet smell of pastries now cloying and sickening, the weight of the rubles in his inner pocket feeling less like opportunity and more like a leaden curse. The shadow had been invited in, and it would not leave until it had consumed everything. The money, a thick stack of rubles wrapped in coarse paper, felt alien and dangerous in Anatoly's hands. He carried it home not with the triumph of a provider, but with the furtive anxiety of a smuggler. That evening, the atmosphere in the small apartment was charged with a fragile, electric hope. For the first time in years, Irina served a cut of real meat, purchased not after hours in a queue, but from a private seller known to Boris's network. The meal was eaten in a near silence punctuated not by the usual weary sighs, but by glances of cautious optimism. Svetlana watched her father, seeing the new tension in his shoulders warring with the light in his eyes. He spoke of his plan with a fervor she hadn't heard in years, describing the leather, the contacts, the surety of the profit. He was trying to convince them, but mostly, Svetlana realized, he was trying to convince himself. The following weeks were a whirlwind of clandestine activity. Anatoly, the meticulous engineer, applied his mind to the logistics of the black market with the same precision he used for machining parts. He met his contact at the port, a shifty-eyed man named Victor who smelled of fish and diesel fuel. The exchange was made in the back of a rusting truck, the bales of soft, supple leather exactly as promised. For a few glorious days, the leather was stored in their apartment, its rich, earthy scent filling the rooms, a tangible symbol of their impending escape from poverty. Anatoly met with the craftsman, a cobbler with gnarled fingers and a bagmaker with a face like a sad bloodhound. Agreements were made, handshakes exchanged. The path forward seemed clear. But the system, with its countless invisible threads of bureaucracy and control, was not so easily circumvented. The problem was not the quality of the goods or the demand, but the movement. To get the leather from the warehouse to the workshops required transport, and transport required permits, waybills, and the tacit approval of local officials, all of whom expected their share. Anatoly, a man of technical diagrams, was hopelessly out of his depth in this murky world of bribes and favors. He approached a low-level functionary in the transportation department, offering a sum of money that felt obscenely large to him. The functionary, a man with a damp handshake and vacant eyes, took the money and did nothing. When Anatoly returned, desperate, the man simply shrugged, speaking in the circular, meaningless jargon of the state apparatus. The documents are under review. There are procedures. Comrade, you must be patient. Patience was a luxury he could not afford. Days turned into weeks. The leather, once a promise of wealth, became a mocking presence in their home. Boris's first collector, a lean, silent man named Yuri, appeared at the factory gate. He didn't threaten. He simply reminded Anatoly of the date, his voice a low, monotone drone. The first payment is due soon, Comrade Anatoly. Boris is a man of his word. He expects others to be the same. The words were polite, but the implication was a cold blade against the throat. The pressure began to warp Anatoly. The confident engineer receded, replaced by a harried, nervous man. He started chain-smoking cheap papacy, the acrid smoke clinging to his clothes and hair. He snapped at Irina over trivialities, something he had never done before. At night, Svetlana would lie awake and hear the low, frantic murmur of her parents' voices from the kitchen, her mother's tones pleading, her father's edged with a despair that was terrifying to hear. The hope that had briefly illuminated their home had curdled into a constant, gnawing fear. The deadline for the first payment arrived. Anatoly had managed to scrape together a fraction of what was owed by selling his father's old watch and a pair of Irina's silver earrings, family heirlooms she parted with without a word, her eyes full of a sorrow too deep for tears. He went to the bakery office alone, the small sum of money a pathetic weight in his pocket. The meeting was short. Boris listened to his explanation about the permits, the bureaucratic delays, his face a mask of stone. He didn't raise his voice. He simply pointed out that the agreement was for a specific sum on a specific date. Delays, he explained calmly, had consequences. The interest would compound. He gave Anatoly 2 more weeks. "Do not disappoint me again, Anatoly," Boris said, his pale eyes holding the engineer's gaze. "A man's word is his capital. When that capital is depleted, what remains?" He didn't wait for an answer, turning his attention to a ledger on his desk. Anatoly was dismissed, walking back out into the street feeling smaller, weaker, and more trapped than he had ever felt in his life. The shadow had grown longer, and now it had a timetable. The clock was ticking, and its sound was the frantic beating of his own heart. The 2-week reprieve was not a mercy. It was a torture, each day a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed the air from their lungs. The apartment, once a humble but safe harbor, transformed into a cage of silent dread. The bales of leather, still stacked in a corner of the main room, were no longer symbols of promise but tombstones for their former life. They seemed to absorb the light and exude a smell of futility. Anatoly became a ghost of his former self. He moved through the rooms with a hunched posture, as if expecting a blow from the ceiling itself. The factory, once a place of purpose, became a source of additional torment. He was acutely aware of the whispers, the sidelong glances from colleagues who knew or suspected his dealings with Boris's world. The foreman, a party loyalist with a face like a clenched fist, had begun to scrutinize his work with unusual intensity, finding minor faults and issuing formal reprimands. It was a subtle pressure, but Anatoly felt its intent, a warning from the system itself, reminding him of his place. He spent his evenings and his one day off in a frantic, humiliating scramble. He visited every relative, every acquaintance he could think of, his pride ground into dust beneath the heel of necessity. He went to his cousin, a successful dentist who lived in a better part of the city. The conversation took place in a tidy kitchen that smelled of disinfectant and boiled milk. Anatoly, his voice thick with shame, laid out his predicament, omitting Boris's name but conveying the urgency. His cousin listened, sipping his tea, his expression a mixture of pity and smug superiority. He spoke of his own burdens, his daughter's piano lessons, the cost of a new Ziguli. He lent Anatoly a paltry sum, barely enough to cover a week's interest, making it clear it was a gift he did not expect back, a transaction to salve his own conscience and be rid of a failing relative. Another day, he sought out an old university friend, now a minor academic. They met in a park, on a bench slick with cold autumn rain. The friend, a man with a kind, weary face, listened with genuine sympathy. But his hands were tied by his own circumstances. A sick mother, a son trying to get into university. "The system, Tolia," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "It squeezes us all. There is no surplus. There is only survival." He offered Anatoly a bottle of homemade samagon, a bitter, fiery liquid that did nothing to warm the cold knot of despair in his stomach. Irina, meanwhile, fought her own quiet battle. She began skipping her lunch at the library, wrapping the few slices of bread and cheese from her ration in a napkin and bringing them home to stretch their evening meal. She approached the head librarian, a formidable woman with the party pin permanently affixed to her chest, and asked, her voice barely a whisper, if there was any possibility of an advance on her salary. The woman peered at her over her spectacles, her gaze dissecting Irina's shabby coat and the faint tremor in her hands. Financial difficulties, Comrade Petrova? The state pays on a scheduled basis. To ask for an advance is to imply the state's planning is insufficient. The request was denied, filed away as a mark of unreliability. Svetlana watched the disintegration of her parents with a growing, chilling comprehension. The world of books, her once impenetrable fortress, now seemed flimsy and irrelevant. The passionate struggles of literary heroes felt like a childish fantasy next to the silent, grinding terror of watching her father age by the day, his hands now constantly shaking, his eyes darting towards the door at every unexpected sound. She tried to help, taking on extra chores, volunteering for longer shifts at the school library where she worked part-time, bringing her meager earnings to her father. He would take the money, his eyes avoiding hers, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The gesture was both tender and devastating, a reversal of roles that shamed them both. One evening, about a week into the reprieve, the silence in the apartment was shattered by a sharp, authoritative knock on the door. It was not the casual rap of a neighbor. It was the sound of demand. All three of them froze. Irina's hand flew to her mouth. Anatoly's face went a sickly gray. He rose slowly, like a man ascending the gallows, and opened the door. It was Yuri, Boris's collector. He didn't step inside, merely filled the doorway, his lean frame blocking the light from the stairwell. His eyes, dark and devoid of expression, scanned the room, pausing for a moment on the stacks of leather, then on Svetlana, who sat rigid on the sofa, a book frozen in her lap. His gaze felt like a physical violation. Anatoly, Yuri said, his voice flat. Boris asks if you require any assistance in meeting your obligations. He has resources. He can make problems disappear. It was not an offer of help. It was a threat, a reminder that Boris's reach extended into realms Anatoly couldn't fathom. It was a suggestion that there were other, more final ways to resolve a debt. No, Anatoly stammered, his voice cracking. No, thank you. I will have the money. Tell Boris I will have it. Yuri held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. See that you do. He turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the concrete staircase. When Anatoly closed the door, he leaned his forehead against the cool wood, his entire body trembling. He didn't turn to face his family. Svetlana looked from her father's hunched back to her mother's tear-streaked face, and then to the leather that had started it all. In that moment, she understood with crystalline clarity that they were not just in debt. They were prey. And the hunt was closing in. The facade of their normal life had crumbled away completely, revealing the raw, terrifying reality beneath. There was no way out, and the walls were growing closer with every passing hour. The final week of the reprieve was a descent into a special kind of hell. The air in the apartment grew so thick with tension it was difficult to breathe. Anatoly had exhausted every avenue. The paltry sums he'd gathered from family and the sale of their few valuables were a cruel joke against the mountain of debt, now swollen with punitive interest. He stopped going to work, calling in sick, his voice a hollow rasp over the communal apartment phone. He couldn't bear the stares, the silent accusations. He spent his days pacing the small living room, a caged animal, his mind racing down endless, dark corridors that all led to the same dead end. Irina moved through the rooms like a ghost, her face a mask of quiet devastation. She stopped going to the library as well, claiming a sudden illness. The truth was, she was paralyzed by a fear so profound it was physical. She jumped at the sound of the water pipes knocking, her heart seizing every time a heavy truck rumbled past their building. She watched her husband disintegrate before her eyes, and the powerlessness was a poison in her veins. She tried to speak to him, to offer some sliver of comfort, but he would just stare through her, his eyes focused on some internal catastrophe. Svetlana, too, was trapped. School became an irrelevance. She attended her classes mechanically, the words of her teachers a distant buzz. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of their apartment and the terrifying, unspoken question, what would happen when the deadline came? She saw the way her father looked at her sometimes, a strange, complex look filled with love, regret, and a new, frightening intensity she couldn't decipher. It was as if he were memorizing her face. The day before the payment was due, the silence was broken by another knock. This one was different, not the sharp rap of Yuri, but heavier, more deliberate. Anatoly, who had been sitting motionless at the kitchen table for hours, flinched as if struck. He looked at Irina, a silent communication passing between them. This was it. He opened the door. It was not Yuri. Boris himself stood in the hallway, flanked by two other men. He wore a heavy, dark wool coat, and his presence seemed to suck all the space from the small landing. He didn't wait for an invitation, he stepped inside, his men following, closing the door behind them. The apartment felt instantly, claustrophobically small. Anatoly, Boris said, his voice a low rumble. His pale eyes swept the room, taking in the shabbiness, the fear, the stacks of useless leather with a single dismissive glance. He didn't remove his coat. Your time is up. I have some of it, Boris, Anatoly stammered, his voice trembling. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a wad of wrinkled rubles. It's not all, but it's a start. I just need more time, I can. Boris ignored the outstretched money. His gaze shifted past Anatoly, landing on Svetlana, who had risen to her feet, her back pressed against the wall. He looked at her for a long, uncomfortable moment, his expression unreadable. Then his eyes traveled to Irina, who stood protectively near her daughter, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. Time is a commodity I no longer wish to extend to you, Anatoly, Boris said, turning his attention back to the broken man before him. Your poor planning is not my concern. A debt is a debt. Please, Anatoly whispered, the word a surrender. Boris was silent for a moment, as if considering. He took a slow step further into the room, his presence dominating the space. There is, however, another way to settle this account. A cleaner way. Anatoly looked up, a flicker of desperate, impossible hope in his eyes. Another way? Boris gestured with his head towards Svetlana, a small, almost casual motion that felt like a physical blow. Your daughter. She is of age. She is presentable. I am without a wife. The debt of it. It disappears. She comes with me. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the frantic ticking of the kitchen clock. Anatoly stared at Boris, his mouth agape, his mind refusing to process the words. It was so monstrous, so far outside the realm of any conceivable reality, that for a moment he thought he had hallucinated. Irina made a small, choked sound, like a wounded animal. Svetlana felt the floor tilt beneath her. The blood drained from her face, leaving her cold and numb. She looked at this man, this brute with his cold eyes and thick hands, and the proposition hung in the air like a foul smell. To be bartered. Like the leather. Then, a sound erupted from Anatoly. It was not a word, but a raw, guttural roar of pure, unadulterated negation. The sound seemed to come from a place deep within him that had not yet been crushed. The desperate hope in his eyes was replaced by a fire Svetlana had not seen in years. No, he shouted, his voice cracking with the force of his emotion. He took a step forward, towards Boris, his own fear forgotten in a surge of paternal fury. Never! Do you hear me? Never! You can take everything else, but not my daughter. Get out! Boris's expression did not change. The flat, calm mask remained in place. He looked at Anatoly not with anger, but with something akin to clinical disappointment, as if a faulty machine had finally confirmed its uselessness. So, Boris said, his voice dangerously soft. That is your final word? You choose ruin for your entire family over a simple, practical solution. I choose my daughter's life. Anatoly cried, his body trembling with adrenaline. Boris gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He looked at Anatoly for a long moment, then his gaze shifted once more to Svetlana, a cold, possessive glance that made her skin crawl. Without another word, he turned. He and his men filed out of the apartment, the door closing with a soft, definitive click. The sound seemed to break the spell. Anatoly's bravado vanished, leaving him shaking and pale. He stumbled back, collapsing into a chair. Irina rushed to Svetlana, clutching her, both of them weeping silently. The proposition had been made. It had been refused. And in its wake, it left not relief, but the certain, chilling knowledge that they had just unleashed a storm far worse than any debt. They had insulted Boris, and a man like Boris did not tolerate insults. The true price of Anatoly's refusal was yet to be paid. The silence that settled over the apartment after Boris's departure was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a verdict being passed in some unseen court. Anatoly sat frozen in the kitchen chair, his face ashen, the brief, defiant fire that had roared to life now completely extinguished, leaving only cold ashes of terror. He stared at the door as if he could still see the imprint of Boris's broad back, his mind replaying those final, catastrophic moments on a loop. He had protected his daughter's future, but in doing so, he had likely signed a death warrant for their present. Irina was the first to move. Her maternal instincts, sharper and more primal than fear, took over. She released Svetlana, her own body trembling, and went to the window. She peered through the grimy glass down into the courtyard. It was empty. "We cannot stay here," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Tolia, we have to leave. Tonight." Anatoly looked up, his eyes unfocused. "Leave? Go where?" "Anywhere." Irina's whisper was frantic. "To my cousin in Smolensk. To your old friend in the countryside. We walk to the train station and we get on the first train leaving the city." "And then what?" Anatoly's voice was a hollow echo. "They will find us. He has people everywhere. At the train stations. He will know within the hour. We have no papers for a proper move, no money for a long journey. We would be fugitives, Irina. With nothing." "We have our lives," she insisted, her hands gripping the back of a chair until her knuckles were white. "We can hide. We can beg." Svetlana listened to the exchange, the numbness beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Her mother was operating on hope and desperation. Her father was operating on the grim, engineering logic of a doomed system. And he was right. Boris's network was a dark mirror of the state itself, omnipresent, efficient, and merciless. To run was to be caught, and being caught while fleeing would only make the punishment worse. "They'll be watching the building," Svetlana said quietly. Both her parents turned to look at her, startled by the calm in her voice. "Yuri or someone else. They knew you would think of running. They're probably outside right now." Her words made the invisible walls of their prison visible. Anatoly let out a shuddering breath and buried his face in his hands. Irina sagged against the wall, the fight draining out of her. The rest of the evening passed in a nightmare pantomime of normalcy. Irina mechanically prepared a thin potato soup. They sat at the table and ate in silence, the food tasting like sawdust. Every creak of the floorboards from the apartment above, every slamming of a car door in the street, made them freeze, their spoons hovering midair, their eyes wide with dread. After the meal, Anatoly did something he hadn't done in years. He went to the small cupboard and took out a box of old family photographs. He didn't say a word. He simply spread them on the table, faded pictures of his and Irina's wedding day, of Svetlana as a chubby-cheeked toddler, of family picnics in a sun-dappled park that now felt like a scene from someone else's life. He traced the outline of his younger, smiling face with a trembling finger. Irina watched him, her tears falling silently. Svetlana understood. He was saying goodbye. He was cataloging the life he was about to lose. Later, as Svetlana lay in her narrow bed, unable to sleep, she heard her father's footsteps approach her door. It opened a crack, and she could see his silhouette framed in the dim light from the hallway. He stood there for a long time, just watching her. She pretended to be asleep, keeping her breathing even. She felt the weight of his gaze, a mixture of boundless love and a bottomless sorrow so immense it seemed to fill the room. Finally, he whispered, so softly she almost didn't hear it, "Forgive me, Svetochka." Then he closed the door. The night stretched on, an eternity of darkness and fear. Svetlana must have drifted into a fitful sleep, because the next thing she knew, she was jolted awake by a sound that turned her blood to ice. It wasn't a knock. It was a series of heavy, deliberate thuds against the front door, the sound of a fist, not knuckles. It was the middle of the night. A wave of pure, animal terror swept through the apartment. She heard her mother gasp in the other room. Her father's bedsprings creaked. The pounding came again, more insistent this time, a sound that promised violence. "Anatoly, open the door," a voice commanded from the hallway. It was not Boris's voice. It was Yuri's, flat and hard as iron. Svetlana scrambled out of bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She crept to her door and peered through the keyhole. She saw her father, dressed in his worn-out pajamas, walking slowly towards the door. His shoulders were slumped in total surrender. He knew. He had known this was coming. He unlocked the door and opened it. Yuri and two other large men stood there, their faces grim in the poor light. They didn't push their way in immediately. "Boris wants to see you," Yuri said. "Now." Anatoly nodded slowly. He didn't ask why. He didn't protest. He simply turned and looked towards the bedroom where Irina stood, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a scream. His eyes met Svetlana's through the keyhole for a fleeting second, a look of utter desolation and a final, silent plea. Then he turned back to the men. "Let me get my coat," he said, his voice eerily calm. One of the men shook his head. "You won't need it." They took him by the arms, not roughly, but with an implacable firmness that brooked no resistance. They led him out into the hallway. The last thing Svetlana saw was the back of her father's pajama shirt before the door swung shut, plunging the apartment back into a silence that was now absolute and forever broken. He was gone. The click of the closing door was the loudest sound Svetlana had ever heard. It echoed in the profound silence of the apartment, a final, brutal period at the end of their life as a family. For a long moment, neither she nor her mother moved, paralyzed by the shock of what had just happened. The reality was too immense, too horrific, to process immediately. It was Irina who broke first, a low, guttural moan escaping her lips as she stumbled out of the bedroom and collapsed against the front door, her hands frantically scrabbling at the wood as if she could pull her husband back through it. "Tolia!" she cried out, her voice cracking with a pain so raw it seemed to tear the air itself. "Anatoly!" Svetlana emerged from her room, her own body trembling uncontrollably. The apartment felt different already, colder, emptier, as if its heart had been ripped out. She went to her mother, not knowing what to do, what to say. There were no words. She simply put her arms around Irina's shaking shoulders and held her as she slid down to the floor, weeping uncontrollably. The hours that followed were a blur of suffocating dread. They didn't sleep. They sat together on the floor in the dark, listening to every sound from the street, jumping at every distant siren, every bark of a dog. Each set of footsteps in the courtyard sent a jolt of terrified hope through them, a hope that was immediately crushed when the footsteps faded or entered another building. The rising sun did nothing to dispel the darkness that had settled in their home. It only illuminated the stark, terrifying truth of their new reality. Anatoly was gone. Taken in the middle of the night by men who answered to no law but their own. Irina, in her despair, wanted to go to the police. It was a desperate, logical thought from a world that no longer existed. Svetlana, with a chilling clarity that felt far beyond her years, had to dissuade her. "Mama, think," she said, her voice soft but firm. "What would we say? That my father, who borrowed money from a black marketeer, was taken because he couldn't pay? They would ask why he needed the money. They would dig into our lives. At best, they would do nothing, call it a criminal matter between criminals. At worst, they could charge him posthumously with speculation. They could ruin his name. Our name." The word, posthumously, hung in the air, unacknowledged but understood by both. Irina stared at her daughter, the last of her hope dying in her eyes. Svetlana was right. The state was not their protector. In this shadow war, there was no cavalry coming. They spent the day in a state of suspended animation. Irina paced the small living room, her movements jerky and erratic. Svetlana sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the entrance to their building, her mind a whirlwind of terrible images. What were they doing to him? Was he being beaten? Tortured? The not knowing was its own form of torture. As evening began to fall, casting long, gloomy shadows across the room, the silence was once again shattered by a knock on the door. This one was not the violent pounding of the night before. It was a single, firm, almost polite rap. Irina gasped and froze. Svetlana's heart leaped into her throat. They looked at each other, a silent, frantic question passing between them. Was it him? Had they let him go? With a surge of desperate hope, Irina rushed to the door and yanked it open. It was not Anatoly. Boris stood there alone. He wore the same heavy wool coat, his hands tucked into his pockets. His face was impassive, but his pale eyes held a cold, final stillness that made Svetlana's blood run cold. He didn't need his men this time. The message he carried was its own weapon. "Irina," he said, his voice a low, even monotone. He didn't wait to be invited in, he simply stepped across the threshold, his presence once again dominating the small space. His gaze swept over the room, noting the disarray, the evidence of a sleepless night, the two terrified women before him. "Where is my husband?" Irina demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and a last shred of defiance. Boris looked at her, his head tilted slightly. He didn't answer immediately, letting the question hang in the air, allowing their imaginations to fill the void. Then he spoke, his words deliberate and chillingly simple. "Anatoly made a choice. He chose to renege on his debt. He chose to insult me. In our world, such choices have consequences. He was given the opportunity to settle his account with his dignity. He refused. Now the account is settled in full." A small, choked sound escaped Irina's lips. She understood. The finality in his tone was absolute. She staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. Svetlana felt the room tilt, a wave of nausea and dizzying grief washing over her. Settled in full. The words were a euphemism more terrifying than any graphic description. Her father was gone. Not just taken. Gone. Boris then turned his gaze to Svetlana. It was a long, calculating look, devoid of any human warmth. He was not looking at a grieving daughter, he was looking at a remaining asset. "The debt," he continued, his eyes locked on Svetlana, "is cleared. Anatoly paid it. But his refusal caused a significant inconvenience. An insult to my reputation must be rectified. The original offer still stands. It is no longer a request." He took a step closer to Svetlana, who stood rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear and grief. "You will come with me. You will be my wife. There will be a ceremony. You will live in my home." He stated it not as a proposal, but as a simple statement of fact, a new, unchangeable reality. Irina let out a wail of protest. "No. You monster. You killed him. You can't have her." Boris didn't even glance at her. His eyes remained on Svetlana. "If you refuse," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "the debt will be considered reopened, and it will be collected from your mother." The threat hung in the air, more potent than any physical blow. He wasn't just threatening Svetlana, he was holding a knife to her mother's throat. He had killed her father, and now he was using her mother's life as leverage to claim her. The brutality of the calculus was breathtaking. He finally turned and walked to the door. He paused on the threshold, delivering his final instruction. "You have until tomorrow evening to prepare. I will send a car for you at 7. Be ready." He left, closing the door softly behind him. The apartment was silent once more, but now the silence was filled with the echoes of his words, with the crushing weight of their new, impossible choice. Svetlana looked at her mother, who was sobbing uncontrollably, a broken vessel of grief and fear. She looked at the empty space where her father should have been. There was no choice at all. The decision had been made for her the moment her father had been led away. She was a commodity, traded to settle a debt written in blood. Her life, as she knew it, was over. The silence Boris left behind was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating shroud that seemed to absorb all light and sound. Irina's sobs were the only thing piercing the void, ragged, gasping sounds that spoke of a soul being torn apart. She slid down the wall to the floor, her body convulsing with the force of her grief. "He's gone, Svetachka," she wailed, her voice thick with agony. "He's really gone. And now he wants to take you too, he wants to take everything." Svetlana did not move. She stood in the center of the room, her arms hanging limply at her sides, her gaze fixed on the spot where Boris had stood. The initial, dizzying wave of terror had receded, leaving behind a strange, hollow calm. It was the calm of absolute certainty, of a path narrowing to a single, terrible destination. Her father was dead. The words echoed in her mind, but they felt distant, abstract, like a story about someone else. The reality of that loss was too vast to comprehend all at once. It was a black hole whose gravity would pull her in and crush her if she looked at it directly. So she didn't. Instead, she focused on the ultimatum. If you refuse, the debt will be collected from your mother. Boris had not made a threat. He had presented a simple, brutal equation. Her freedom in exchange for her mother's life. It was not a choice. It was a transaction. Her father had tried to fight, to defy the terms of their grim reality, and he had been erased. Resistance was suicide, not just for her, but for the one person she had left. Her mother's life was the only currency she had left. Irina looked up, her face ravaged by tears. "We can run," she whispered, her voice desperate and broken. "We can disappear, like I said. We'll go tonight now." Svetlana finally turned to look at her mother. Her own face was pale, but unnervingly composed. "Where, Mama?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "To Smolensk? He would find us within a week. To the countryside? We have no papers for a new life. We have no money. We would be hiding in ditches, and his men would be hunting us. He killed Papa for a debt. What do you think he would do to us for defiance and for stealing what he now considers his property?" The cold, logical finality of her words extinguished the last flicker of hope in Irina's eyes. She knew her daughter was right. The world outside their door was no longer a place of potential escape. It was Boris's domain, a web he controlled. "He'll kill me if you don't go," Irina said, the statement a quiet, horrifying realization. "He'll kill me and he'll take you anyway." Svetlana nodded slowly. Yes. The single word hung between them, a verdict. There were no more tears, no more hysterics. There was only the stark, unadorned truth of their situation. The fight had gone out of both of them, replaced by a numb, weary acceptance. Svetlana walked to the window. The courtyard below was quiet. A light snow had begun to fall, dusting the grim concrete with a thin, deceptive layer of purity. She watched the flakes swirl in the glow of a lone street lamp. This was her last night in this home, her last night as Svetlana Petrova, the girl who dreamed of university and lost herself in books. Tomorrow she would become someone else, a possession, a trophy, a silent ghost in the house of the man who had destroyed her family. She thought of her father's final look, the one he had given her through the keyhole. "Forgive me." She understood it now. He had seen this coming. He had known that his refusal would not save her, only doom himself and pass the burden to her. And yet she could not find it in her heart to blame him. What father could willingly hand his daughter to a monster? His refusal was his last, desperate act of love, a final, flawed attempt to protect her. The failure was not his. It was the failure of the world they lived in, a world where men like Boris could operate with such impunity. "I will go, Mama," Svetlana said, still looking out at the falling snow. She didn't turn around. She couldn't bear to see the relief and the shame that would surely be warring on her mother's face. Irina let out a choked sob. "Svetachka, my girl, I can't let you. I can't." "You have to," Svetlana interrupted, her voice still calm, though a faint tremor had entered it. "It is the only way you live. That is all that matters now. You have to live." She finally turned from the window. Her eyes were dry, but held a depth of sorrow that was far more profound than tears. "We must pack," he said, to be ready. The next hours were a surreal and painful ritual. They moved through the apartment like sleepwalkers, gathering Svetlana's meager belongings. A few dresses, her undergarments, her toiletries. It felt like packing for a funeral. Irina tried to give her a small, framed photograph of the three of them, taken on a summer day by the river, but Svetlana shook her head. "No," she said softly. "I can't take that with me." The memory of that happiness would be a torture in Boris's house. As she folded her last sweater, her fingers brushed against the cover of a book on her nightstand, a collection of Akhmatova's poetry. She paused, then slowly picked it up. It was small, its cover worn. She slipped it into the bottom of her bag. It was the only piece of her old self she would allow herself to smuggle into her new life. Not a photograph of a happiness that was dead, but words. Words that had always been her refuge. Perhaps they could be again even there. When the small suitcase was closed, there was nothing left to do but wait. They sat together on the sofa, not speaking, Irina holding Svetlana's hand in a bone-crushing grip. They watched the light change outside as the short winter day faded into an early, gloomy dusk. The hands of the clock on the wall seemed to crawl, each tick a hammer blow against Svetlana's heart. At 5 minutes to 7, they saw it, a black Volga sedan, sleek and official-looking, pull into the courtyard and park directly opposite their building. It was the car of someone with importance, with power. It was the car that would take her to her new life. Svetlana stood up. Her legs felt weak, but they held her. She put on her coat. Irina stood as well, her face a mask of anguish. "I love you, Mama," Svetlana said, her voice barely a whisper. Irina pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace. "My brave girl. Forgive me. Forgive us all." A sharp, double tap of a car horn sounded from the courtyard. The signal. The wait was over. Svetlana gently disentangled herself from her mother's arms. She picked up her suitcase, walked to the door, and opened it without looking back. She could not look back. If she saw her mother's face, her courage would shatter. She walked out of the apartment, down the dimly lit stairs, and out into the cold, snow-filled air. The back door of the Volga was opened from the inside by Yuri. She caught a glimpse of his impassive face before she slid into the leather-scented interior. The door closed with a solid, expensive thud. The car pulled away smoothly. Svetlana did not look back at her building, at her window. She kept her eyes fixed forward as the familiar, gray world of her childhood slid past and disappeared into the twilight. The bargain was sealed. The Volga moved through the dimly lit streets of Minsk with a smooth, authoritative grace that felt alien to Svetlana. She was used to the lurching, crowded buses and the rattling trams. This silent, purposeful glide through the falling snow felt like being transported to another planet. She sat in the back, Yuri a silent, looming presence beside her, her small suitcase on her lap like a shield. She kept her gaze fixed on the world outside the window, watching the familiar landmarks of her life pass by, the school, the library where her mother worked, the market where they stood in endless queues, until they crossed the river into a part of the city she rarely visited. Here, the grim Khrushchevka blocks gave way to older, more solid pre-revolutionary buildings and even some newer, discreet apartment complexes reserved for the party elite and those, like Boris, who operated in its shadow. The car finally stopped in front of a handsome, 4-story stone building with a wrought iron gate. Yuri got out, opened her door, and took her suitcase without a word. He led her through the gate and up to a heavy, polished wooden door on the first floor. He produced a key, unlocked it, and gestured for her to enter. The apartment was a world away from her own. It was spacious, with high ceilings and parquet floors covered in thick, oriental rugs. The air was warm and smelled of polish and expensive tobacco. The furniture was heavy and dark, a mix of Soviet-made replicas of classic styles and a few genuine, antiques pieces that spoke of access to special stores or the black market. There were no personal touches, no family photographs, no knickknacks, no books lying around. It was the home of a man who saw his residence as a display of power, not a place of warmth. Boris was sitting in a large armchair near a tiled stove, reading a newspaper. He looked up as she entered, his pale eyes assessing her. He was dressed in a simple but well-made turtleneck and dark trousers. He did not smile. "Your room is down the hall, the last door on the left," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, as if giving instructions to a new servant. "You will keep it tidy. Meals are at 8, 1 and 7. You do not leave the apartment unless Yuri or I am with you. Is that understood?" Svetlana nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "Good." He returned to his newspaper, dismissing her. Yuri led her down a hallway and opened a door. The room was small and sparsely furnished. A narrow bed with a plain blanket, a wardrobe, a small table, and a chair. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling. It was a servant's room or a prisoner's cell. Yuri placed her suitcase on the bed and left, closing the door behind him. She heard the distinct click of a key turning in the lock from the outside. She was alone. She stood in the center of the room for a long time, simply breathing, trying to absorb the reality of her situation. The numbness that had protected her was beginning to wear off, replaced by a cold, creeping horror. She was a captive. Her life had been reduced to this single, locked room in the home of her father's murderer. The days fell into a grim, monotonous routine. She was unlocked in the mornings by a stern, silent woman named Maria who came to clean and cook. Svetlana was expected to help with the household chores, dusting, polishing, peeling potatoes. It was a deliberate humiliation, a way to reinforce her position. Boris largely ignored her, treating her as a piece of furniture that had been acquired. He would occasionally address her with a curt command, but there was no conversation. In the evenings, he would often have men over for business discussions. She would hear the low rumble of their voices from her room, the clink of glasses. They never spoke of her father, but his ghost was a permanent presence in the apartment, a silent accusation. A week after her arrival, Boris informed her that the wedding would take place in 2 days. It was not a discussion. The event was a hollow, grotesque parody. It was held at a bleak state registry office, the Zags. There were no guests from her side, only Boris, Yuri, and 2 other grim-faced men who acted as witnesses. She wore a simple, dark dress she had brought from home. Boris wore his usual suit. The official, a bored-looking woman, recited the standard Soviet text without looking up from her papers. When she asked for their consent, Boris grunted. Svetlana's own was a whisper, a sound of surrender that felt like ash in her mouth. There was no ring. There was no kiss. They signed the documents, and it was over. They drove back to the apartment in silence. That night, the lock on her bedroom door was not turned. The physical violation was as cold and transactional as everything else. Boris came to her room, performed his marital duty with a detached, mechanical efficiency, and left without a word. Svetlana lay in the dark afterwards, staring at the ceiling, feeling a part of herself wither and die. She was no longer just a prisoner, her body was now officially occupied territory. Her only solace, her only act of rebellion, was the small book of Akhmetova's poetry. She kept it hidden under her mattress and would only take it out late at night, reading the verses by the sliver of light coming under the door. The words of a woman who had also endured immense suffering, who had waited in prison queues for a son, who had written of the terrible years of Yezhovshchina, became her secret lifeline. You will hear thunder and remember me and think, she wanted storms. She clung to those words. They did not give her hope, but they gave her a strange, grim strength. They reminded her that she still had a mind, a soul, that Boris could not touch. She learned the rhythms of his life, his comings and goings. She heard snippets of his conversations, understood more about his network, his dealings in everything from stolen machinery to imported cosmetics. She stored every piece of information away, a useless treasure trove of secrets. She saw how the system worked for him, the way certain officials would visit, the way scarce goods would appear in their kitchen. He was a parasite on the body of the state, and he flourished in its decay. One afternoon, about a month after the wedding, Maria was out and Boris was away on business. Yuri had unlocked her door to allow her to clean the main room. The telephone, a heavy, black rotary device, rang. It was a rare occurrence. She hesitated, then picked it up. It was her mother. Her voice was thin, strained, laced with a constant, underlying fear. "Svetochka? Is it you? Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mama," Svetlana said, her own voice a monotone, her eyes scanning the room to ensure she was alone. It was a lie, but a necessary one. "A man comes by every week," Irina whispered. "He asks if I need anything. He brings me groceries." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they were a chilling confirmation of the deal. Her mother was being kept alive and comfortable as long as Svetlana played her part. "That's good, Mama," Svetlana said. "I have to go." "Wait, I love." Svetlana hung up the phone, her hand trembling. The connection to her old life was now just another leash, another means of control. She was trapped in a gilded cage, her mother's survival the price of her continued captivity. The new reality was absolute. She was Boris's wife. And she was utterly, completely alone. The seasons turned, marked only by the changing quality of light through the thick glass of the apartment windows. 1 year bled into 2. Svetlana moved through her life as a ghost in Boris's house, a silent, efficient shadow. The initial, sharp edge of her terror had dulled into a constant, low-frequency hum of despair, a background radiation to her existence. She performed her wifely duties, managing the household under Maria's supervision, appearing at Boris's side on the rare occasions he required a silent, presentable woman to complete a picture of domestic normalcy for his associates. In their private life, he continued to use her body with the same impersonal detachment, a nightly reminder of her status as purchased property. Yet, within the stifling silence of her mind, a quiet, observant part of her remained alive. It was the part that had devoured literature, that understood subtext and motive. She became a student of her captor and his world. She learned to read the subtle signs in Boris's demeanor, the tightening of his jaw when a deal was uncertain, the rare, almost imperceptible relaxation when a shipment of contraband Western electronics cleared customs, the cold fury that simmered beneath his calm when someone failed him. She stored it all away, this useless intelligence, a habit born from a mind that refused to go completely dormant. The world outside their insulated apartment was beginning to change. The faint echoes of it seeped through the state-controlled radio broadcasts Boris listened to and the hushed, more candid conversations his visitors sometimes had when they'd had too much vodka. Words like perestroika and glasnost were uttered, at first with derision, then with a growing unease. The rigid, predictable system that had been the backdrop to Boris's operations was starting to tremble. New, younger, more reckless gangs were emerging, less bound by the old, criminal codes of conduct. The stable corruption that Boris had mastered was becoming a more volatile, competitive marketplace. Svetlana noticed the shift in him. He was away more often. The phone rang late into the night. His cold calm was occasionally fractured by flashes of a sharper, more volatile temper. He once backhanded Yuri for a minor logistical error, a breach of his usual controlled discipline that shocked even his stony-faced lieutenant. The fortress walls, she realized, were developing cracks. It was during this time of simmering instability that a single, small event became a catalyst. Boris was hosting 2 men from Riga, negotiations over a truckload of stolen Ukrainian pork. The men were louder, brasher than his usual associates. One of them, emboldened by drink, leered at Svetlana as she brought a tray of glasses to the table. "Your wife is very quiet, Boris," the man slurred, his eyes roaming over her. "A pretty little thing. You should teach her to smile more." Boris's expression did not change, but Svetlana, who had learned to read the minuscule signs, saw the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. It was not protective jealousy. It was the irritation of a man whose property was being publicly appraised without his permission. "She is quiet," Boris said, his voice flat. "That is why I keep her." The man from Riga laughed, a harsh, braying sound. He reached out, grabbing Svetlana's wrist as she tried to retreat. His grip was like a vice. Maybe she needs a man with a little more energy. For a fraction of a second, Svetlana froze, a wave of revulsion and panic washing over her. Her eyes met Boris's. In that instant she saw it clearly. He would not defend her. He would allow it. She was a commodity, And to him, this was merely a potential renegotiation of ownership, a cost of doing business with unruly partners. A cold fury, white-hot and pure, erupted within her. It was the first real, undiluted emotion she had felt in years. Without thinking, she wrenched her arm back with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The man, caught off balance, released her with a grunt of surprise. "Do not touch me," she said, her voice low and shaking, but clear as ice in the sudden silence of the room. All eyes were on her. The man from Riga looked from her to Boris, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. Boris was staring at her, his pale eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated shock. She had never defied him. She had never spoken out of turn. In that single act, she had broken the fundamental rule of her captivity: passive submission. For a long moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room was palpable. Boris's shock quickly calcified into cold rage. But he was, above all, a businessman. A scene now would be bad for business. "Leave us," he commanded her, his voice dangerously quiet. She didn't hesitate. She turned and walked out of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs, a strange, exhilarating terror coursing through her veins. She had drawn a line. It was a small, futile line, but it was hers. Later that night, after the men had gone, he came to her room. He didn't touch her. He stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the light from the hall. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said, his voice a low growl. She said nothing, staring at him from where she sat on the edge of the bed. The fear was there, a cold stone in her stomach, but it was now mixed with something else, a flicker of defiance. "You think the world is changing?" he asked, a cynical smirk twisting his lips. "You think you can be saved? There is no salvation. Only power. And I still have it. Remember your mother." He left, locking the door behind him. But the threat, for the first time, felt different. It was the same threat, but her perception of it had shifted. His power was real, but it was no longer absolute in her mind. She had seen the cracks. She had seen his shock. He had expected a slave, and for a moment, he had seen a person. That night, she took out her book of Akhmatova. She didn't read it. She simply held it, the worn cover a tangible link to the self she had been forced to bury. The world outside was changing. The man who held her was feeling pressure. And she, Svetlana, the quiet ghost, had just spoken. It was not freedom. It was not even the beginning of an escape. But it was a spark in the long, dark night of her captivity. And for the first time in years, she began to watch and wait, not with the passive despair of a victim, but with the patient, calculating attention of someone who might, one day, see a chance. The spark of defiance, once lit, did not die. It smoldered quietly within Svetlana, a secret fire banked beneath the ashes of her submission. The world outside Boris's fortress continued its slow, inexorable unraveling. The echoes of change were no longer faint, they were a persistent drumbeat. The Berlin Wall fell, not in a news bulletin Boris could ignore, but in a seismic shift that sent tremors through his entire operation. His East German contacts, once reliable conduits for certain goods, vanished into the chaos of reunification. The old, predictable corruption of the Soviet state was being replaced by a chaotic, Wild West capitalism that was, in its own way, more dangerous. Boris grew older, weary. The cold calm that had been his trademark was increasingly replaced by a simmering, paranoid rage. The younger wolves in his organization, sensing a weakening alpha, began to test his authority. Money was siphoned. Shipments went missing. The once impenetrable network of fear he had built was developing leaks. Svetlana watched it all, her silent observation now sharpened by a newfound, grim purpose. She was no longer just waiting for an end, she was looking for a crack wide enough to slip through. The catalyst came in the form of a man named Dmitri. Younger, sharper, and crueler than Boris, he had been a junior enforcer and was now openly challenging for control. A tense, hostile meeting took place in the apartment. Svetlana, bringing in tea, heard the raised voices, the threats that were no longer veiled. "Your time is past, old man," Dmitri sneered. "You rule a graveyard. The new world belongs to those who are not afraid to get their hands dirty. I built this. Boris's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. I will bury you in it. You can try. But your walls are thin. And your wife is very pretty. It would be a shame if something happened to her. An accident, perhaps. Svetlana's blood ran cold. She had become a pawn in a power struggle, her value reduced to her utility as a target. That night, Boris was more agitated than she had ever seen him. He paced, he drank, and for the first time, he spoke to her not as a master to a slave, but as a man facing his own mortality. They are jackals, he muttered, more to himself than to her. They have no honor. No code. He looked at her, his pale eyes clouded with vodka and frustration. You have been quiet all these years. What do you think? It was a trap, or perhaps a moment of profound, lonely weakness. Svetlana met his gaze and said the only thing that felt true. I think you are losing. He stared at her, stunned into silence. Then, a strange, choked sound escaped him. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. It was the sound of a man realizing his own reflection has just spoken a truth he dared not admit. He did not strike her. He simply turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. The invincible Boris was gone, replaced by a vulnerable, aging man. In that moment, Svetlana knew his protection, fragile and self-serving as it was about to vanish completely. The end of the USSR, when it was formally dissolved in 1991, was not a celebration for her. It was the final collapse of the world she had known, the world in which her father had lived and died, the world that had created men like Boris. It was chaos, and chaos was both a threat and an opportunity. Boris's empire crumbled with the state that had been its host. His contacts in the military and the party were irrelevant. His money was tied up in assets that were now worthless. Dmitry and his faction moved in for the kill. One evening, Boris did not come home. Yuri arrived at the apartment, his face grim. He looked at Svetlana with a new, almost respectful wariness. Boris is gone, he said flatly. There was an accident. With his car. The brakes failed. Svetlana understood. The jackals had won. Dmitry is in charge now, Yuri continued. He has asked for you. He remembers you. The unspoken threat was clear. Her value as Boris's widow was zero. Her value as a young woman to a brutal new boss was a different, more terrifying prospect. This was her moment. The crack was here. Tell Dmitry, Svetlana said, her voice steady, though her heart was a wild drum, that Boris kept a private ledger. He kept it hidden from everyone. Even from you, Yuri. It details every payment, every bribe, to every official for the last 10 years. Names, dates, amounts. It was a bluff, a desperate gamble woven from fragments of overheard conversations and a deep understanding of a paranoid man. But she delivered it with absolute conviction. Yuri's eyes widened slightly. The information was a weapon of mass destruction in the new, uncertain landscape. Where is it? He asked, his voice low. It is safe, Svetlana said. And it remains safe and unknown as long as I and my mother are left alone. You tell Dmitry that. I disappear. My mother disappears. And the ledger disappears with me. If he tries to find us, if anything happens to us, the ledger goes to the first newspaper that will print it. There are many now. She held her breath, watching the calculations play out behind Yuri's eyes. Hunting her down was a risk. The potential fallout from that ledger in this new, pseudo-free press environment was immense. She was a loose end, but a dangerous one to pull. Finally, Yuri gave a curt nod. I will tell him. He turned to leave, then paused. You are smarter than he thought. He left, and Svetlana was alone. She didn't pack. She took only her small suitcase from years before, the one she had never fully unpacked. From the bottom, she retrieved her copy of Akhmetova. She walked out of the apartment, down the stairs, and out onto the street. She did not look back. She went straight to the phone box on the corner, her fingers trembling as she dialed her mother's number. Mama, she said, the word a sob of relief and exhaustion. Pack one bag. We are leaving. I will explain everything. They met at the train station, two ghosts in the chaotic, bustling crowd of the new Russia. They bought 2 tickets to a small, anonymous town in the south, a place no one would think to look. They had no plan, no money, only the clothes on their backs and the terrifying, exhilarating taste of freedom. As the train pulled out of the station, carrying them away from the city of their nightmares, Svetlana looked at her mother. Irina's face was lined with years of fear, but her eyes, for the first time in a decade, held a fragile light. They were alive. They were together. Svetlana turned to the window, watching the gray sprawl of Minsk recede into the distance. The past was a country of ghosts and graves. The future was a terrifying blank. But it was theirs. The long winter was over. They had emerged from the shadow, scarred and broken, but alive. They would have to learn how to live again, how to breathe without the weight of a debt written in blood. It would be a long, difficult road, but for the first time since her father was taken, the road was their own.